So, in continuation of our major topic, history of history, now we will turn our attention towards Chinese historiography. I told you in the beginning that there are two streams. One is the Mediterranean one, the other is Chinese. So, let us concentrate on Chinese today. Chinese historiography. The influence of Chinese historiography was rather confined to China, more or less, and then that is one quarter of the mankind. One should not forget that. The evolution of Chinese culture is rather late in relation to the cultures of Egypt, Iraq, and even India, Indus civilization. Yet, where it distinguishes itself over these cultures is in its continuity once it arose around 2000 BC. That is a remarkable achievement of Chinese people. So, geographically, China is divided in two zones, whereas in the northern zone, the climate is colder and resembles the climate of Europe. The climate of southern zone resembles India. That is why in that part, southern province, you have rice cultivation and other things. Besides, China is fairly mountainous, much more than India. Therefore, if any country could be divided into many cultural units because of the geography, then it was China, and yet only is Chinese history characterized by its continuity, but even more significantly by its unity. Chinese society thus, betrays an ability to overcome geographical barriers so as to achieve cultural unity. One major factor facilitating this cultural unification was the development of a uniform script. This is how we can explain the unity. Script. By 2000 BC, or certainly by 1500 BC, a fairly developed writing, mostly pictographic and ideographic, seems to have evolved in China. Moreover, the Chinese quite early on appear to have developed a grammar as well, arrangement of the words and letter alphabets, and thus and written script began to take shape quite independent of speech. No matter how you spoke a particular word, you had to write it the same way. It is characteristic of China, therefore, that while the Chinese Thais, Tibetans, Mongols, Manchurians, etc., were spoken differently, they were written alike and had the same written alphabets, even Japanese for that matter. Later, as the independent growth of written language continued, it began to develop syllables and determinants. This growth of written language, independent of speech, as I said earlier also, all over China played a pivotal role in unifying the country. And more significantly, its literati, China could thus be characterized as a country divided politically but united culturally, whose literati were closely knitted together and recognized a unified entity of China. Now, the first person whom we should reckon with his contribution is Confucius. He was born in 551 BC at Qufu, state of Lu, now in Shandong province, China, and died in 479 BC at Lu only. A philosopher of 5th century BC, 6th century BC, sorry for the typographical mistake. His tremendous influence over the Chinese literati can justifiably be said to be another unifying influence, apart from script. Unifying, influence in the evolution of the Chinese literary culture. He provided the Chinese literati with a framework of ethics, and thus his personality in unifying the Chinese culture played the same role that religion did elsewhere. He was by no means a saint, a Buddha of China. He was always, if I can take this liberty to say like this, without, hurting anybody's feelings, he was always hankering after political office, and his lust for office often even led him to put to death his rivals. Political unity in China was rather late, and the only transitory. Towards the close of the 3rd century BC, some semblance of political unity was provided by Qi Huangdi of the Qin Dynasty. Being a despot, he hated historians like all despots, they hate historians because we always say something which they don't like. And the historians averse to the idea of despotism in turn hated him. So it was a reciprocal thing. But what is significant is, from our point of view, is that they created the idea of political unity and gave the concept of a dominant dynasty. After him, therefore, tables of dynasties came to be constructed and dynastic history came to be written. So, by 221 BC, one hears of the Chinese expecting to be united under one dynasty, that is Qin Dynasty, 221 BC to 206 BC. Next important person is Sima Qian. He is variously called Sima Qian. Earlier, till 70s they were called Sima Qian, but now there is a general agreement, Sima Qian also. But now there is a general agreement that it should be spelled as Sima Qian. That is the official rendering of his name. He wrote a book called Shiji, and he was not the only author of Shiji. His father also partly contributed to it. I will elaborate upon that later on. Shiji is the record of the scribe. Sima Qian was probably born in 145 BC. Two sources, both written by Qian himself, give information on his life. A preface written by the Honorable Grand Scribe himself, Taishong Zixu, included as the final 130th chapter of Shiji. This is a biographical essay where he talks about himself. The second is a letter he wrote to his friend Ren An in 93 BC. Later, in reply to Ren An, I have given the Chinese equivalents. I won't be reading them, but it is for you to read them, so it is there in the written form. Qian's life can be divided into 4 periods. His youth is spent in the Sima family house, 145 to 127 BC. The nearly 2 decades he spent studying, traveling, beginning to work on Shiji, 126 to 109 BC. Quite a long period. The 16 years in which he completed a draft of his history, 108 to 93 BC, his final years during which he revised portions of his text. The postface says Sima Qian took part in farming and pasturing on the family's land as a child. At the age of 10, he was thoroughly conversant with ancient writings, Guwen. With the founding of Han Dynasty 206 to 220 AD, the Chancellor Zeno He had noted that the prefect of the Grand Scribes was responsible for examining young scholars, and that only those, and this will give you an idea how rigorous that system was, only those who are able to read aloud and write out from the memory more than 9,000 graphs can become scribes. Such powerful memory he should possess. The test also demanded familiarity with 6 styles, Liu Ti, of writing characters. This gives us an idea about young Sima Qian's rigorous training and academic accomplishments. By 127 BC, the entire family has been moved to Maoling by imperial order to help populate the new town with distinguished and powerful families, and at the same time to bring these families under closer court supervision. This was the new capital which was created by Wu. This year begins the second of Qian's life, during which he lived with his father and probably worked with him on the draft that later became Shiji. Residing near the capital and hearing about court life from his father was Qian's introduction to Emperor Wu and his policies. So, right from the beginning, I want to say that look here, the close proximity to the center of power provided him an advantageous position from which he could hear and he could develop those faculties which would be useful for his writing history in future. The young emperor, born in 156 BC, was only a decade older than Qian, it is very clear from our records, but ruled through all but the last years of Qian's life. It is perhaps in part with contemporary politics in mind that Sima Qian's history evolved. Sima Qian was his father. Sima Qian would acquire first-hand knowledge about court politics. Apart from this, he could greatly expand his knowledge in this period through formal study and, as I said earlier, extensive travels to regions drained by Yangtze, Jiang, Yuan, Huai, Sea and Yellow rivers. This covers a vast territory of China. Essentially, the eastern and western parts of Han Empire. Visiting famous mountains, historic sites, graves of former worthies, collecting legends from their graves and from oral traditions, learning regional customs and lore from elders, experiencing the cultures and social practices of the many areas and peoples. He returned to Chang'an in 122 BC. Besides these oral sources, he may have also gained access to provincial libraries such as those collected by Liu Di, the king of Henan 155 to 130 BC, or that of Liu An in Hunan 164 to he ruled 164 to 122 BC. These were massive libraries and he had access to them. After his return to capital, Sima Qian studied the Shangshu under Kong Anguo and the Chungkui spring and autumn annals under Dong Zhongshu. He was the teacher. He also received his first official position, that of palace gentleman Langzong, no later than 118 BC. Though his rank was low, the post afforded access to the emperor as a palace guard and a member of the retinue of the emperor, and contact with other talented young palace gentlemen such as his two very bosom friends, Ren An and Tian Ren. Both became friends of Emperor trusted him and sent him in 111 BC as an imperial envoy to inspect and pacify local tribes in modern Sichuan and Yunnan. The other story is about the widow named King of Ba and Shu in chapter 129 of his book. Another material in the biographies of the money makers. This is a very interesting chapter. He returned to the capital in 110 BC. At that time, his father Sima Qian was accompanying the emperor Wu to worship at Taishan. They were supposed to, offer some rituals at the feet of the god at Taishan. At that time, Sima Qian, his father, fell ill and wrote to Sima Qian not to forget the writings, which Sima Qian had written. 3 years after his father's death, 188 BC, Sima Qian replaced Qian as grand scribe. This also marks the third era in Qian's life, which I have already talked to you, when he completed the draft of Shiji. This provided him access to the imperial library and archives, collections which had been steadily enlarged throughout the first century of Han rule. Though Sima Qian's travels has led scholars to label him as Chinese Herodotus, because Herodotus I told you that he was a great traveler. He had traveled into so many places, Persia, Syria and others like him, of course within China, but China is such a vast territory. So, and collections which he has been steadily enlarged. Then through these travels, he is a careful use of rich written sources that reveal a scholarly nature equally reminiscent of Tacitus. There is a difference between Herodotus and Tacitus, if you remember those differences. So, this combination of sources transcended not only temporal but regional bounds as well. Sima Qian was soon involved in planning and compiling new calendar to replace the Zia calendar, which must have occupied most of his time, because calendar making is not an easy job. Qian and his colleagues were also to determine a new dynastic color for the Han Dynasty. In his postface, Sima Qian himself gives an account of the order and purpose of the various sections that came to make up the Tai Chong Shu, that is, documents of the Grand Scribe, as the Shiji was first titled. He put in order the laws and ordinances. Han Xin set forth the rules of warfare. Zhang Kang made the regulation and standards. Sun Shun Tong stabilized the rites and ceremonies. Refined scholars of textual learned began to be presented to the emperor, and Shi Jing, classic of poetry, and Shang Shu, venerated documents, gradually reappeared. From the time when Cao Khan recommended Master's Guy's teachings of the Yellow Emperor and Laozi, when Master Jia Yi and Chao Kuo elucidated the doctrines of the legalists, Shen Buhai and Lord Shang and Gongshun Hong achieved eminence for his classical learning in the space of 100 years. The writings that were passed down and the records of old affairs were without exception all collected by grand scribes. The grand scribes, father and son duo, each in turn held and carried on this position, and this will continue in his family for some time. Sima Qian argued that Simas would work and lend history the same order that Xiao Hei, Han Xin and others provided their areas of expertise. Qian introduces subgenres, 12 basic annals, Benji, which trace chronologically the rulers of China from earliest antiquity down to Qian's own Emperor Wu. Then the 10 chronological tables, Nian Biao, which display all the major events of each year in the various political entities that made up China throughout the ages. Another 10 treatises, Shu, which are historical accounts of subjects such as music, ritual, and on these themes he will be writing about ritual or geography. Then 30 hereditary houses, Shiji, which follow the development of states of pre-Han China as well as the Han kingdoms, and finally 70 biographies or memoirs, Li Zuan, which present interpretative accounts of hundreds of men and women, also a few neighboring peoples. Each chapter was shown to fit history as Sima Qian and his father meant to relate it. It has been argued that there is a hierarchy from the annals which suggest a unified empire, verifiable from earlier records, the tables representing the noble lineages, the treaties offering a topical treatment of the material in the annals, the houses attempting to subsume a multi-state reality into image of a strong central state, and the memoirs praising those men who accumulated merit and fame. This is the observation of Edward Lewis, cited by William H. Neuenhauser when he was writing about our theme, Sima Qian. Yet Shiji is more complex. Any single interpretation cannot be given by this is the observation of Grand Hardy. They have worked on Shiji and their writings are available. Shiji supplemented 6 disciplines, and it is evident in his introductory chapter of Basic Annals. He writes, scholars often, I quote a lengthy quotation, but it is a very significant quotation for understanding what was his approach or methodology towards history. This becomes evident from this. Scholars often claim that the 5 emperors belong to high antiquity, but Shang Shu the only records Yao and the rulers thereafter. When the scholars of the different schools talk about Yellow Emperor, their words are not appropriate. Even civil officials or old masters would have trouble explaining this. What Confucius transmitted in his answer to Zai Yu's question, some Confucian scholars have not transmitted. I once travelled west to Mount Kongtong and passed Mount Zhaolu to the north. To the east, I drifted along the coast and to the south I floated the Huai and the Jiang rivers. Wherever I went, all of the village elders would point out for me sites of the Yellow Emperor. This is the oral history, he is collecting information from. Yao and Shun. The traditions were certainly very different from each other. He is talking about the conflicting opinions or conflicting narratives. In some, he writes that which was not far from the ancient text versions, that is in terms of time, of the classics tends to be more plausible. What I have read in Shungqi, Spring and Autumn Annals, and the Guayu, that is Discourses of the States, sheds light on the virtues of 5 emperors and the surnames of the successive emperors and makes them clearer. Though they did not investigate the problem deeply, what they try to show is not without basis. He is defending them. The Shangshu missed some things and has certain deficiencies. He admits that. What is missing there from time to time can be seen in other accounts. So, he is corresponding the counter checking the two. That is the historical method of historical writing. If one were not a person fond of pursuing and pondering deeply so as to conceive the ideas in his mind, one would certainly have a hard time to relate, that is to write history, to those who have only a superficial view and are ill informed. I edited and selected, here he is making it very clear, I edited and selected these words which are the most appropriate according to his own methodology. For these reasons, I put this as the first chapter of the basic annals. Sima Qian, like Herodotus, depends, as I said, on oral traditions in dealing with 5 mythical rulers, 5 emperors, but unlike Herodotus, he was able to add some details like, for example, machinations of Emperor Shun's father and brother in their attempt to kill him. He gives the details of that. He admits that he collected additional material from oral traditions relayed to him by the village elders he consulted in his travels. Much has been written about his sources, but it seems that the general idea or multi-genre study of earlier history and even perhaps even some of the sub-generic generic categories came from Lu Bue's Lu Shi Chungkui, that is Spring and Autumn Annals of Mr. Lu, as his biography in the Shiji relates. He gives a detailed biography of this gentleman. Sima Qian explains how Lu attempted to match those other states whose lords maintained huge corps of knights and retainers. It is true that these genres are not, identical to those found in the Shiji. The diversity and the size of Lu Shi Chunkui may well have proved a model for the Simas. Sima Qian must have confronted the immense physical difficulties in citing sources. Those texts were written on bamboo and wooden slips, and they are remarkable numbers. According to him, not me, according to him, estimation of the size of Shiji itself has over 21,000 bamboo slips on which they were written. He had large number of assistants to assist him. He tells us about that. It is not a one-man, enterprise. A third and perhaps the most essential question raised by Qian's depiction of the composition of his history is, what part of it was actually written by Sima Qian? Did Sima Qian complete his Shiji? In finishing his work on the text, however, he tells us that he left 2 versions, the original concealed at a famous mountain, Kangzi, Mingshan, and a copy in the capital, Fuzhai, Jingxi. This is, he writes about that he had left 2 versions. His book is the first complete historical work that has survived. It is called Shiji. This is also translated as Records of a Historian. but we will call it Record of a Scribe, and was written with the ambition of compiling all possible earlier records that have survived. How they were arrived at, I have told you about that, and dealing with as many events that appeared significant to the author as were possible. So, he is not collecting all the things, he is selective about it. It is divided into several portions. The first deals with dynastic annals, second with the memoirs of kings and nobles along with their biographies, and there are separate portions dealing with rites and ceremonies, rituals, law, financial matters, trade and commerce, astronomy and calendar, geography, music and literature. To write such a history so versatile and multifaceted, and not to think of political history alone as important, like many scholars do, is in itself a great feat, a remarkable achievement on the part of Sima Qian. He was writing for the literati, obviously, like our author of Tariq-e-Firozshahi, Barni. Thus, he wrote of everything that was important for the literati. And look at the vast interest the literati had. They were not confined to one or two things. He is very sure about the impartiality of a historian. He makes clear that historians should not be partisan. He should not be partisan. His appreciation of objectivity is clear from the manner of his narration. He first assembles all the information that he could get on a particular individual or an event, even when they appear contradictory, and then gives his comments at the end. First, he will narrate the thing. He has no particular case to make on behalf of one dynasty against another. He is not talking about in those terms. His honesty is most explicit in his description of Socrates, whose failures he describes as painstakingly as his achievements. There is no element of magic, myth or supernatural forces in his account. So, he belonged to the family of courtiers and practically inherited the post of compiling annals from his father. But unlike his father, he had a larger interest than just compilation of data. He traveled all over China and often collected local traditions wherever he went. I am reiterating that, so that very often notice him supporting written records with local traditions. Nowadays, in our modern historiography, we also put a lot of emphasis on field work. This is, and people say that this is the new tradition in historiography. It is not. Sima Qian had done it much earlier. He had a very skeptical view of kings and courts, rightly so, and treats them as ordinary human beings capable of committing as much errors and mistakes as an ordinary people do. His cynic attitude towards monarchy perhaps had something to do with the harsh fate he had to suffer at their hands. The general of the Han army was defeated and captured by the Hans. Shuma, I will be intermixing this very often. This is Sima Qian tried to justify the capitulations of the general, whereupon the Han ruler dismissed Shuma and had him physically mutilated. Later, he was appointed to the post of State Secretary, a lower post, but with similar responsibility of compiling data. But his rancor against the kings and courts persisted. This is our idea. He is not writing that. Other major characteristics of Sima Qian's accounts are: it is the first history of China, a recognition that China is a unified state. All previous records were annals or chronicles of one kingdom or another, and stray records about one region or another. There was no history of China as a uniform whole. It was written on the basis of the other, then surviving histories. It thus preserves a large many histories preceding Sima Qian, which would otherwise have got lost. He is very faithful to the earlier texts, except that he has, whenever needed, modernized. Within quote I write this, modernized, because he says that I have modernized it, their language, and that I had replaced their obsolete words and phrases by colloquial or existing terminology to make it more sensible to the people of the time. His narration of events or individuals is peculiar. Why? Because first he provides almost all the details he has been able to lay his hands on from differences, and then provides the reader with his comments either on the personality or on the individual being discussed. He will give his opinion on that. He refuses to accept the intervention of supernatural powers, unlike our Greek historians, most of the Greek historians. In that sense, he is, it is a scientific history. He has shorn off all aristocratic or hierarchical biases. Burney was outstanding for his, aristocratic biases against the people. To him, no particular family, no particular race, region or people can possibly be inherently superior to another. It is nothing something inbuilt. Those who support the race theory, they believe in that. He is contradicting it. So, he has a very strong sense of chronology that makes him outstanding as a historian of all peoples. It were the Chinese who developed an acute sense of chronology. The Chinese had established a calendar independent of any royal fiats by 841 BC. Later, they developed a 60-year cycle of 12 years each. Sima was already heir to a calendar system and to a system in which chronology is important. In that respect, he has an advantage over the Greeks. And as I told you earlier, he was also preparing a calendar himself, which was a difficult task. To him, dynastic annals are not only one part of history. He is not a mere court historian. His account has separate chapters on rites and rituals and customs, laws, literature, wealth, primitive economics, philosophy, music and ceremonies. He also provides biographical accounts of, besides the politicians, men of literature and philosophers, which is not done. In India, we hear about them only when we come to, Abul Fazl's Ain-i-Akbari. But Abul Fazl comes in 16th century AD, and this gentleman is writing so early. His prose is simple. By the time he sat down to writing, Chinese prose had become insufferably ornamental. He established a prose for history writing which was simple and concise, and this is still the trend now. Nobody likes flowery English when you are writing history. It should be very simple and straightforward. His style became a model to be imitated by the subsequent Chinese historians, and I think we should also try to imitate him. So far, this is right style is concerned. It is a history of the literati. Indeed, not a people's history. It deals with every topic that would have interested the literati then, and is therefore a very useful indicator of the interest of the Chinese educated elite. Sima Qian's historical achievements were immediately recognized, and subsequent historians imitated him. The Tang Dynasty 618–1907 AD organized a huge collection of annals of previous dynasties. These histories had the tendency to include original documents, memorials, memorandums, letters, etc. And these dynastic histories therefore became repositories of archives. Later, it became a trend among rulers to compile a dispassionate history of their preceding dynasties. These histories included sections on literatures, rites, customs, etc., and exceeded hundreds of volumes, but they are all, on the line, initiated by Sima Qian. That is his contribution, and for which we, discussed him today. Well,